Hello and welcome to the History Extra podcast from BBC History Magazine, Britain's best-selling history magazine. I'm Ellie Cawthorne. For today's episode, I spoke to Lara Makelem, the author of Mudlarking, Lost and Found on the River Thames. Lara's book is about her passion for mudlarking, which is scouring the foreshore of the river in search of historical objects that have been washed up by the tide. I spoke to her about some of the finds she's made over the years and what makes mudlarking such an alluring obsession. So, for listeners who may not know anything about mudlarking, what is it and why is it so appealing?
Well, mudlarking is basically going down onto the foreshore of a river. In my case, it's the Thames, to search for lost and forgotten objects. So a lot of what I find is very old because I searched the Thames. It's got 2,000 years plus of history. So when the tide goes down, when the tide's low, that's when we go down to search. And the reason I find it so obsessive, really, because I'd say probably I am obsessed by it, is it's that real sort of hands-on history. It's really unique. It's that feeling that when you're down there, you're almost time traveling. And when you pick something up, you know that you're the first person, sometimes in thousands of years, to have touched it since the last person used or dropped it. And that feeling is priceless. I can't imagine anything, that would match it. And the Thames has such a wide, rich and varied history, and you never know what you're going to find next because every tide reveals something completely different. So it's almost like a giant history book, I suppose, and each tide is turning a page, and that is why I find it so obsessive.
When you're searching the Thames, how far back do the finds go? What are some of the oldest objects that you've found?
Well, I mean, obviously the oldest things are the fossils because, you do find quite a lot of fossils and they tell the story of the river itself. The oldest man-made objects are worked flints. So I've got some Mesolithic flints, scrapers and the end of a little arrowhead. And they're wonderful, they're thousands and thousands of years old. And then it really is a timeline. It goes right the way through Bronze Age, Iron Age, medieval, Saxon, Viking, Roman. You can find something of everything down on the foreshore. It's just a mixed up muddle of history. There's no layers, easily definable layers at all. It's just a mixture of everything.
In the book, you characterise most mudlarks as either hunters or gatherers, you call them. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yes, I mean I've been mudlarking for about 15 years, and I've seen it change quite a bit. When I first started, there were a lot less people doing it, and there weren't that many women, and it's changed quite a lot. There's a lot more people doing it, and a lot less detectorists doing it, and people who dig and scrape. So there's a lot more people like me who search the surface. And I divide, I suppose, the searchers. I've sort of watched people over this time, and I've divided them into two groups. I suppose I am generalizing a bit, but there are other people who are very driven by the find, and they tend to be the people who scrape and dig and almost force the river to give up its contents. And then there are the people more like me. I go down and I have quite a philosophical approach, I suppose, to it. And I only take what's been left on that recent tide. So if it's lying on the surface and I can find it just using my eyes, then I take it with me because I sort of reason that if it's not picked up, it's going to wash away or it's going to be damaged. And so I'm kind of saving it for history. Whereas I sort of think cutting into the river's surface and taking what it's not ready to give up yet, it is a very different approach. I go down there for more than just the finds, the things that are down there for to get away from the city. It's my escape from the city as much as anything else. And sometimes I come back with absolutely nothing, but most times I come back with something.
So if we were to head down to the foreshore of the Thames with you, what would some of the most common objects we might come across be?
The most common objects is pottery. There's pottery down there that really sort of tracks the history of London from prehistory through to IKEA plates, and clay pipes. There's clay pipe stems absolutely everywhere. I found them from the tidal head at Teddington right out to the estuary, and in parts of central London particularly, they are absolutely everywhere. They really are the cigarette ends of history, I suppose.
Something that's really interesting in the book is that you detail and come across everyday objects which were once ubiquitous, but I think now we might not be familiar with. Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, I mean, the things that I find, I mean, I'm never going to get rich from mudlocking. I'm not a treasure hunter at all. I'm probably best described as archaeologically curious, or sort of, I have a fascination with this, just the ordinary side of history, and it's really the rubbish that people lost and threw away, the sort of things that you're just not going to see in a museum. So, things as innocent, I suppose, as just an ordinary dress pin that. They're very common if you know where to look and how to look for them. But the objects that I find are just, I suppose, just rubbish, the throwaway things on the whole. And dress pins really, I think, summarise that for me, because they were made in their hundreds of thousands, but each one's a little work of art, really, because each one is handmade, the old ones, the old copper alloy ones. And they date from between 1400 and 1800. And everybody wore them, and they must have shed them in their hundreds of thousands, because they wash up in these sort of nests and piles. The river washes them together, washes objects together by weight and size, and the dress pins particularly wash up in certain areas. And they're just so ordinary that I think that they summarise for me the ordinary nature of the objects that I find.
It seems like you have a remarkable ability when you spot something of working out whether it's of interest or not. When you do find something, how do you go about working out what it is, how old it is, and where it might have come from?
A lot of mudlark is knowing what you're looking at. It's all very well going down there and having a look, but unless you know what you're looking at is worth picking up and taking home, then you're going to leave an awful lot behind. And I know that I have left an awful lot behind. I mean, I've been doing it for quite a while, and I've learnt on the job, I suppose. And you sort of get to know whether something's sort of feels old. It just looks old. I've got a library of very strange books for a start. I talk to other mudlarks, and there's the Portable Antiquities Scheme database, which is invaluable for looking things up. There's over 1 million objects on there now that have been recorded. There's sort of lost and forgotten objects that have been found in fields and beaches and other rivers. And that's a great resource. And also, under the terms of my license, I do report the objects that I've found. Anything historically important and over 300 years old needs to be reported to a finds liaison officer. And they're brilliant. You take it along to them, and if you don't know what it is, they often do know what it is. And if they don't know what it is, then they have a whole, resource of people and books and places that they can go to find out. So I've really just learned as I've gone. And you get a lot of the same objects on the foreshore. So you'll find a lot of the same pottery. So you learn about the pottery as you go. You learn about certain things, what they look like. And then occasionally I'll find something and I have absolutely no idea what it is. And that's when I usually take it off to my finds liaison officer and get some help with it.
And you have had finds personally that have fallen within the category of treasure. Can you tell us about those?
I have, yes. You legally have to report treasure, and it's a bit more complicated than this, but simply put, it's anything over 300 years old that has a percentage of precious metal, gold or silver. And I have had several things reported. One was a 16th century posy ring, which was made of silver, that had the words "I live in hope" engraved on the inside, and that was particularly poignant because you sort of imagine the person that threw it into the river after they lost hope. It's quite sad. And the other object is a gold lace end. That's also 16th century. It's Tudor, and it's part of a mini hoard that's gradually washing out of the foreshore in a place that will remain unknown to everyone. And there's I think almost 200 objects, little tiny pieces of gold have come out of this area. And they are thought to be, because each one is either squashed or broken in some way, they're thought to be possibly a bag of scrap gold that was dropped or thrown into the river at some point, and the bag's rotted away, and all these little pieces of gold are scattering across the foreshore. So that's with the Museum of London. They wanted that. They're collecting as much of it as they can. And I've donated that to them as part of their collection. And the posy ring I got to keep. So that's in my collection.
Picking up on your point about the posy ring and the personalised inscription on it, you have quite an interesting approach to objects which are explicitly personal. Can you explain that to us?
People throw things into the river because I suppose it's moving. It takes people's problems away with it, and it takes away the objects that they don't want anymore. When they throw it in, it's gone. They don't have to see it anymore. And I find a lot of personal possessions, old ones and new ones. Love tokens. I found a lot of love tokens. The bent sixpences. I've got 8 of those now. The posy ring. When I slipped it on my finger, it just felt strange and wrong to wear it because somehow somebody had wanted to get rid of it. It just didn't have a good feeling about it. Mudlarks find a lot of modern wedding and engagement rings, particularly under the bridges where people have thrown them in. I found a modern wedding ring and I just didn't want it. I just didn't want it in my life. It didn't feel right. It felt like whoever had thrown it in meant for it to be in the river, so I threw it back. Not all mudlarks do. Some of them take them, but for me, it just feels too personal. Sometimes you find torn up love letters, photographs, the more modern things. I found a box of someone's ashes, human ashes, which posed a real moral dilemma. You know, you find these things, and it's almost like you're intruding into other people's lives, and it really does make you stop and think. And with the ashes, I thought about it for a long time, and I'd wondered why someone hadn't opened the box and scattered the ashes. And I thought, well, I don't know anything about these people. It's not for me to scatter this person by any means. I can't take it away with me. So I dropped it back into the river. But, you know, at some point it's going to wash up somewhere else and maybe be someone else's dilemma.
What are some of your most historically significant or interesting finds?
I suppose that goes back to just the ordinary things. You know, you're constantly finding out about the way ordinary people lived. And I think personally, the historically interesting things are things like shoes, because they are preserved so beautifully in the Thames mud because it's anaerobic. It lacks oxygen, so it preserves organic matter perfectly. And to pull something like that out of the mud, and to actually see something that's made of leather that would otherwise have rotted away, that to me is historically important because, you know, in museums there's all lots of gold things, metal things and things like that. But when you pull something out that's made of wood or leather, that to me feels like a little piece of a little time capsule almost that's unique to the river.
Still to come on the History Extra podcast.
To be found on the foreshore, you know, you can find a lot more near where there was an old set of stairs and people were constantly getting in and out of the wherries and the boats and unloading things than you will out in the middle of the estuary, because you're not going to find a great deal out there.
Do you think the Thames is unique in what it offers a mudlark, or do other places with rivers offer similar opportunities?
Do you know, a lot of people ask me that because, you know, not everyone is lucky enough to live in London or near London. As far as I know, the Thames is pretty unique simply because it has such intense human habitation, so a lot of finds, such a lengthy human habitation, you know, since the Roman times, if not before, and because it's tidal, so you have access to the riverbed twice every 24 hours. There are rivers that are tidal that don't have that same intense human habitation, and there are rivers that, like the Seine, if you could get to the riverbed of the Seine, it would be incredible. You'd find just the same sort of things, but it's not tidal. I know that they drained part of the canal network in Amsterdam when they were building the metro, and they found 700,000 objects in the canal. So the canals in Amsterdam have the same objects there, but they're not tidal. So as far as I know, the Thames is pretty unique, but people use rivers as rubbish dumps. They've always used rivers as rubbish dumps. They're very convenient. So even the smallest river running through a town or village is worth searching, because you'll probably find Victorian bottles or things like that people have thrown in it if you can get down onto the riverbed.
You start the book at the tidal head in Teddington, and you take the reader all the way down to the estuary. What are some of your personal favourite locations to hunt for treasure along the Thames?
I search lots of different places. I search a lot in central London because that's where you find the most and the most varied objects. I love the estuary just because it's just lovely. It's just barren and windswept and just beautiful, and you don't see anyone. I rarely go west just because it's easier for me to get to East London. I mean, there's 160 kilometres of tidal Thames, give or take. So it's a long, long bit. I tend to go to places according to my mood. If I'm feeling sociable, I go to central London because I know I'll meet lots of people. If I'm feeling less sociable, then I go further east where I know I won't meet anyone. I write about a lot of the places I go, not all of them. I'm not telling everyone about all my secret places. I've got one particular place that I love going that I'd never tell anyone about because it's my private place. So yeah, it really depends on my mood where I go to. But I probably have about 5 different places that I visit regularly.
So what do you think makes a really good mudlark?
I think patience is the most important thing. It takes a long time to get your eye. Well, you're very lucky if you go down there and you instantly get your eye in and you're good at mudlarking. It's something that it's just time and persistence, and you learn to read the foreshore and you learn about the river and how it works and how it deposits things. So it's I would say the most important thing is definitely time, persistence and patience. Some people can do it and some people can't. Some people never get their eye in. They just give up. And some people are really good at it and they get it very, very quickly and they just start seeing things. For most of us, it's just time. It's time and patience.
Something that struck me in the book was that it's not just about wandering down to a random section of the Thames and seeing what you come across. There's a huge amount of historical detective work involved that you talk about. Can you give us an idea of some of the preparations you make before you head off on a mudlarking trip?
Yeah, I mean, like I say, the tidal Thames is 160 kilometres long. That's a lot of river, and if you think you've got both sides of the river as well, so you need to have some idea of where's good to search. So the old maps are fantastic because you can look at them and work out where the stairs were and the causeways, maybe where there was a warehouse, what people were doing where, and that gives you some idea of where there might be things to be found on the foreshore. You know, you're going to find a lot more near where there was an old set of stairs and people were constantly getting in and out of the wherries and the boats and unloading things than you will out in the middle of the estuary, because you're not going to find a great deal out there. So it's really worth doing a little bit of research. In terms of preparation to go mudlarking, you obviously need to check the tide tables. You need to know when the river's going to be low because that changes every day. And you have about 2 to 3 hours either side of the low tide. The tide tables also tell you how low the tide's going to drop. So, you know, ideally you want the really low ones because then you'll have more foreshore to search. And when you go down there, you need to know where your access points are, how to get on, and more importantly, how to get off. Because when the tide turns, you can get cut off. There are pinch points, and you really don't want to be wading back through icy cold river water like I did once. You need to check the weather. You need to check out when it's going to get dark. So there's a lot of preparation goes into a mudlarking. Anyone going down onto the foreshore of the River Thames needs to have a licence to look. If you're going down with the intention of searching, you need to have a licence. They're easy to get. You can get them from the Port of London Authority, and they actually own the foreshores, so they're the landowners, and you just apply to them online, and you can get a permit that lasts 3 years. And under the terms of your permit, there are areas that you can't go into, you can't search. There are scheduled monuments like Queen Hythe, and there are also restrictions on whether you can disturb the foreshore in certain areas. So all that information comes with your permit, and it's really important to read all of that and to mudlark responsibly. It's also really important to report what you find, and it's really important to know what people are finding.
One of the most fascinating stories in the book that I really wanted to ask you about was the story of dove type. Can you just tell the listeners a bit about what dove type was and how it found its way into the Thames?
Yeah, I love the dove's type too. It was a story that began at the turn of the 20th century, and it involved a man called Cobden Sanderson and his business partner, Emery Walker. And together they created this typeface, which Cobden Sanderson considered to be the most perfect type ever created. He imbued all sorts of quasi-religious associations with it, and he only wanted to use this typeface to print the most perfect books. And they printed the Bible and the works of Milton and the works of Wordsworth, and they didn't produce many books, but they were very successful. And the two men worked together quite successfully for a number of years. But Cobden Sanderson became more and more obsessed and more difficult to work with, and eventually the two men fell out. And Walker decided as his severance he wanted half of everything from the dove's type. And I should say that they set up the dove's type on the banks of the river at Hammersmith. And as part of his severance, he wanted half of everything, and that included the type. And Cobden Sanderson couldn't countenance that. And so instead of letting Walker take away his beautiful type, he decided, the 70-year-old man decided that he was going to throw all of it into the river to get rid of it, so that nobody could take it and nobody could use it for any sort of commercial gain at all. And over the course of about 6 months in 1916, going into 1917, he dumped 500,000 little tiny lead slugs of type into the river at Hammersmith. And soon after that, he died, and it was lost. This font was lost forever. There was nothing left of it, absolutely nothing. And so fast forward to about 10 years ago, and a man called Robert Greene comes along, and he's a type designer, and he wants to use the dove's type on. And he tries to recreate it from the typed material that he's got, but it's too difficult because when you press metal into soft paper, it distorts, and he can't get it perfect. He wants to produce a digital version of it. He just can't recreate it. So he decides to read all of Cobden Sanderson's journals, and there's a lot of them. They're quite rambling and they're a little bit strange, to work out where he threw the type. And so he does, and he thinks he knows where it is, and he goes down and he finds 3 pieces on his first visit, and he takes scuba divers from the Port of London Authority back with him on his second visit, and they find altogether 148 pieces of 500,000 pieces. So you can imagine that's all he's found, but it's enough for him to recreate this type. And I interviewed him for the book, and he let slip a few details of where he went to look for the type. And I thought, okay, I'll go down and I'll see if I can find some of it. And I went down, and on my first visit, I found a comma, and it's the only comma in existence. And it belongs to me. And so I persuaded my publishers to set the epigraphs in my book in dove's type so that everyone can see how beautiful it is, because it really is a beautiful type. And I went down one more time, and I found an F, and that's what I have, and that's all I need of this. And so that's basically in a very short way, the story of the dove's type.
So 100 years from now, if there's your equivalent, a mudlark of the future, what do you think that they will be coveting from our age, and what do you think they'll be plagued by?
It's difficult because, even the coins that people are still, flicking coins into the river. People have done that for centuries, haven't they? And it's that kind of, make a wish. But even our coins aren't going to be around because they've got a steel core, and the modern ones I find are already starting to rust away. So even our coins aren't going to be left. What they'll find is lots and lots of plastic, I'm afraid, all sorts of plastic. And I don't know if they're going to value plastic in the future, or whether it's still going to be a scourge like it is now. maybe they'll be looking for iPhones. We find a lot of phones in foreshore, lots of iPhones. A lot of people throwing away their iPhones for one reason or another. I think what they'll be looking for, to be honest, are the Hindu statues and the religious objects that people are still throwing in, because that can be quite beautiful. And I found a lot of those, particularly Hindu, but also Tao and Islamic and all sorts of religious objects. So I think that those will be the things that the mudlarks of the future will be looking for.
So my final question would be, and this might be impossible for you to answer, if I was going to come to your house and take away all your collection of treasures that you found over the years, and you're only allowed to keep 3 items, which would you hold on to?
I would definitely save my Tudor shoe, which is my favourite object. It's a child's shoe and it dates from the 16th century and it's just perfect. And I went through hell and high water, quite literally, to get it conserved because nobody wanted it. And I finally managed to get it conserved at the University of Cardiff by a student. And that is my favourite object. So I definitely hold on to that. I would also hold on to my posy ring because that's just really special, really special. It's beautiful, and it tells such a wonderful story. And I'd also hold on to my 17th century ivory sundial, pocket sundial, because it's just so unusual. It's really unusual. And that's one of the objects I found that is really historically important, I suppose. Oh God, it's so hard because there's so many bits that I wouldn't want to lose. But those are probably the things I'd save.
That was Lara Maitland. Her book, Mudlarking, Lost and Found on the River Thames, is available now, published by Bloomsbury. If you're looking for more history content, why not check out the Christmas issue of BBC History magazine, with features on the fall of Rome and Britain, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and strange historical Christmas traditions. Or head to our website, HistoryExtra.com. Thanks for listening. Today's podcast was produced by Ben Hewitt and Jack Bateman. Tune in again on Thursday when we'll be discussing the experience of Asian migrants in 1980s Britain.